Imagine risking everything, your freedom, even your very own life, in order to help strangers. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the stories of everyday heroes who defy danger and injustice to fuel the Underground Railroad. From daring escapes to ingenious hiding places, stay tuned to see how their bravery lit the path to freedom. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. And if I sound a little nasally, it's because I'm getting over a cold, so I apologize. Today's episode is another piece of history that I was obsessed with as a kid. Just like the orphan train story that I shared with you guys, the Underground Railroad is a story I've wanted to tell since well before I ever started this podcast. But I knew the story was very complex, that was going to require a lot of careful research in order to do the story justice. Now, as long as this episode is, there are still so many amazing stories that I couldn't put in here. And so my hope with this episode is that it'll pique your interest and you'll find it as fascinating as I do, and it will inspire you to dig deeper and learn more about some of the amazing people who shaped our history and worked so hard to make our country a better place for all people. Feel free to use the timestamps to skip right past this, but I do have to give you guys a quick disclaimer. If you would notice that I am avoiding certain words, there's a reason for it. Unfortunately, there are a lot of words that get censored on this platform. Now, personally, I thought this was kind of a common knowledge thing, but I recently got a comment from someone who was highly offended and thought that I was avoiding the severity of certain topics by using abbreviations like SA, for example, instead of actually just saying what it is. So I thought I would just address it in case some of you guys are watching and you aren't aware of the way that creators are censored on the internet. I would hate for it to take away from the subject of today's story because you're fuming about the fact that I didn't just say the harsh words already. It's not that creators are trying to downplay serious topics. It's that YouTube considers a lot of these topics sensitive subjects, and so we try to say things in a way that don't trigger whatever AI is searching for certain words and then limit the reach of the video so that people don't see it. So if you enjoyed this episode, please share it if you know someone who would enjoy it. I try to play by the rules, but this video is still likely to get censored. So I would appreciate your help in getting this episode out. And also, since a lot of my content does get flagged as not safe for ads, I just enabled memberships on my channel. So if you want to support my content, that's a way you could do it. You just get stuff like special emojis and things like that. Otherwise, liking, commenting, and sharing with others is the very best way that you can help my channel to grow. So thank you guys for being here. Despite its name, the Underground Railroad was neither a railroad nor was it underground. It was a series of networks, routes, and meeting points used by enslaved Black Americans to escape from their captors in the South to the free states in the North and eventually on into Canada. There's no exact date that we can pinpoint of when this all started, but looking at historical clues, we catch a glimpse of this movement throughout the late 18th and early 19th centuries. Most of these clues can be found in a quote, a speech, or a letter. Often these writings were from abolitionists who opposed slavery and worked to abolish it no matter the cost. We can also gather some context around this movement from old letters that slaveholders sent out when they had a slave who ran away from their plantation. In a 1786 complaint, George Washington wrote about religious Quakers who had attempted to liberate one of his neighbor's slaves. 30 years later, a Quaker man by the name of Isaac T. Hopper began arranging an escape network in the city of Philadelphia designed to help enslaved people to escape. At this time, there was no name for this movement, but his was one of several routes that over time would become known as the Underground Railroad. Isaac Hopper was an abolitionist and, as such, opposed slavery on every front. Abolitionists were made up of both white and Black people who were fighting for the complete elimination of slavery. Many white abolitionists, or Quakers, Reformed Presbyterians, and Methodists who believed slavery went against religious teachings. They argued that every human being had a right to be free, and therefore slavery was a violation of human rights. rights. A lot of their work was centered around bringing an end to the social acceptance of slavery. And they also fought to change the laws that allowed Black people to be seen as some type of possession that could be owned by another person. As abolitionists called for the immediate emancipation of all enslaved people, anti-slavery societies were formed to spread information and educate people. In those days, the best ways to do this was by spreading around pamphlets, leaflets, and holding secret meetings. This is how they got new followers and grew their movement. They also sent people to lobby Congress, run for political office, and they blasted anti-slavery literature throughout the southern United States. The people who spoke out, giving speeches and publishing their writings, were very brave. The opposition they faced was pretty fierce. Slavery had made plantation owners into very wealthy men, and they weren't going to let go of that without a fight. And at times, the people these abolitionists were speaking out against were their friends, relatives, and neighbors. So coming out publicly with this stuff was kind of like going directly into the lion's den. Abolitionists sometimes became the victims of mob violence or were even arrested for their stance. Every abolitionist faced the moral dilemma of complying with the laws of the land versus defying laws that would bring harm to another human being. For abolitionists, both Black and white, it was far worse to comply with laws that brought harm to others. Helping enslaved people escape and head north to freedom was therefore the moral choice. Participating in the Underground Railroad became the ultimate act of civil disobedience. Let's hit pause on that for a quick minute and come back to the present with me. Did you guys realize that this is Thanksgiving week? Happy Thanksgiving! I know for many of us, our favorite part about Thanksgiving week is the Black Friday deals. Black Friday is also the perfect time to get holiday shopping done early. And if you're anything like me, you've probably been waiting on the sales to start so that you can finish up or even start your shopping. And if that's you, I have just the thing for you. You may have heard me talk about Anna Louisa. I've shown you guys quite a few pieces from them over the past year. They've also held up really nicely. So my Stephanie ring is the one I can't shut up about, but luckily Anna Louisa's pieces are water resistant. So even with getting it wet, washing my hands or taking a shower or whatnot, it has not tarnished at all. So I got a few new pieces to try from Anna Louisa and surprise, surprise, I got some more rings this time. So I have this beautiful accent ring. I find it's really hard to find rings for my thumb because of my knuckle, like the size of my knuckle. I'm sure you guys know, but like your knuckle's just weird on your thumb, right? And this one is perfect as a thumb ring. And I also got this stackable set, which of course can be worn together or by themselves. And I've really just been loving the plain gold band in this set. It's very similar to my Stephanie ring. And so I've been wearing it a lot as a simple wedding band, which I'm really loving right now. Anna Louisa's pieces are hypoallergenic, come with a 2-year warranty, free shipping and exchanges for all of their U.S. customers, and to top it all off, they come beautifully packaged and already ready for gifting. To help us kick off the holiday season, Anna Louisa is having a huge sale with Black Friday exclusive discounts, so don't miss out on one of the biggest deals of the year because the more you buy, the more you save. I know, it sounds like girl math, but that doesn't make it not true. This sale is for a limited time only, so check out the description box below and snag some luxury pieces at unbeatable prices. Now back to the episode. Unfortunately, slavery has existed for all of recorded human history. But for the purposes of today's episode, we're going to skip ahead to how slavery was introduced in the Americas. The precursor to slavery in the United States was the Portuguese slave trade that began in the 15th century. Once the colonies were established in North America, South America, and the West Indies, an economy based on large plantations began to flourish. This drove the need for cheap labor in mass quantities to to run these large farms. The first African people were brought over to America in the year 1619. They were likely taken from a Portuguese ship, and it's believed that there were about 20 Africans. They sailed into Jamestown, Virginia, where they were promptly traded for goods. But at this time, they weren't yet labeled as slaves. They were classified as indentured servants. Indentured servants were often both black and white people who had agreed to work for a certain number of years in exchange for transportation to a new country, food, clothing, and shelter. Once their time had been served, the debt was considered paid, and they were supposed to be set free. Indentured servitude was a common practice in the colonial era and was used to fill the labor needs of colonies like Virginia and Maryland. As the history of slavery in the United States unfold, and you see just how barbaric it was, you can also see the unfolding of hope and witness the power of the common man to fight back against what he feels is morally unacceptable. And as we go through a brief timeline of events, you will see these two threads intertwine over 200 years of history. In 1640, 3 indentured servants ran away and were recaptured. 2 of them were white, and the third was a black man by the name of John Punch. For running away, the white servants had more years added to their time as indentured servants. But John Punch was sentenced to being an indentured servant for life, making him the first official slave in the English colonies. Many historians see this event as a key milestone in the development of slavery as an institution in what would become the United States. The very next year, in 1641, Massachusetts legalized slavery, becoming the first of the colonies to recognize enslaving human beings as a practice. In 1662, a law in Virginia was passed stating that if an enslaved woman had a child, that child would also be a slave, regardless of who the father was. This was the first step towards developing the Virginia slave codes that would be implemented in 1705. In 1676, both white and black people in Virginia united to fight against the wealthy landowners and the governor of Virginia in Bacon's Rebellion. Although this rebellion ended up fizzling out when Bacon died suddenly from illness, it served as a wake-up call for the slaveholders. Once they realized that they could be outnumbered, they rushed to start making stricter slave laws. On February 16th, 1688, the Quakers in Pennsylvania stood together and drafted their own anti-slavery resolution. It was the first anti-slavery resolution for any group in the United States. In 1705, the Virginia Slave Code codified the status of enslaved people in the state. Now, to codify a law means that all of the laws and statutes about a certain matter are all gathered together and they're organized in a way to make them much more clear. And this was done with the intention that if the law was easier to understand, then it could be much more easily enforced. And this further eliminated the freedoms of black people living in America by defining the rights that slave owners had over them. The Virginia Slave Code allowed slaveholders to punish their slaves without any fear of legal repercussions. It also laid out specific rewards for runaway slaves. In 1712, the population of New York City was about 6,000 to 8,000 people, with 1,000 of those people being enslaved. Robert Hunter, the colonial governor of New York, wrote about the beginning of the rebellion. He wrote about how one slave set fire to his master's shed, and then how they all went out together and marched to the fire. The noise from the fire caused people from the town to come running, and that the slaves fired upon them and killed 9 people, seriously injuring 6 others. Local militia were awakened and sent after them. 27 people who were hiding in the swamps were located. 6 of them ended it all instead of facing trial, while most of the others were convicted and faced brutal public execution, including being burned alive or being hung by chains in the center of the city for all to witness. This battle marked a significant turn in the lives of enslaved people in New York. The city made stricter laws against black people. They were no longer allowed to own firearms or even gather in groups. Slaveholders were now allowed to beat their slaves as much as they wanted, as long as they were not permanently maimed. Now, to discourage slaveholders from setting their slaves free, they now are required to pay a $200 bond before they could set anyone free, which, of course, back then was a very large sum of money. In 1799, slavery was outlawed in New York, but the city continued to profit off of products like molasses and sugar that were created by slave labor in the Caribbean through the time of the Civil War. And this brings us to the start of the Revolutionary War in 1770. Tensions were high between British soldiers and laborers in Boston because the British soldiers often took part-time jobs away from laborers by accepting the work for lower wages, which obviously infuriated the laborers. On March 5th, 1770, a group of sailors gathered together to march down King Street into Boston. They were carrying clubs and ice balls to swing and throw at British soldiers. Chaos ensued, and the soldiers fired into the crowd, killing 5 men. This became known as the Boston Massacre. One of the men killed was Crispus Attucks, who was shot in the chest by 2 musket balls from a British rifle. He was of Native American and African descent and was believed to have been enslaved and had run away. His name was originally given as Michael Johnson, which was either a Christianized name that had been given to him by his enslavers or possibly an alias that he had adopted to protect himself after his escape. Historians have noted that there was an advertisement for an escaped slave named Crispus in the Boston Gazette, and this is how his whole story was kind of pieced together. He was listed as having been born in Massachusetts, and at the time of his death, he was living in New Providence, Bahamas as a sailor. A trial was held, and the soldiers and their commanding officers were acquitted of any wrongdoing, which, of course, only fueled the growing fury against British soldiers occupying Boston. The famous John Adams was a lawyer for the British Crown at the time, and he wrote that the attack was started by a motley rabble of saucy boys who were black, Irish, and sailors. Of course, the language used at that time is a bit different than how we talk now, but his description is believed to have been an attempt to paint the sailors as lower class citizens who weren't local to that area. As the number of citizens dissatisfied with the institution of slavery began to grow, the Pennsylvania Abolitionist Society was founded. And as the battle for America's independence from Britain grew into a full-scale war in 1775, around 5,000 African American men served in the fight as soldiers and sailors. This included both free and enslaved black men. And surprisingly for the time, they were given nearly equal treatment to white soldiers. The only difference is that they weren't allowed to hold higher ranks. On July 4th, 1776, the Continental Congress adopted the Declaration of Independence, marking the end of the Revolutionary War and the beginning of the United States as a country independent from Great Britain. On February 12th, 1793, Congress passed the first Fugitive Slave Act. This made it illegal to harbor a runaway slave or to interfere with a runaway slave who was being arrested. That same year, Lieutenant Governor John Graves Simcoe of Canada passed an act to prevent the further introduction of slaves and limit the term of contracts for servitude within this province. This legislation did not immediately end slavery in the colony, but it did prevent the importation of slaves into Canada. So as a result, any U.S. slave crossed the border into Canada, they couldn't legally be transported back into the States. So this meant they were completely free. Between the 1600s and the 1800s, more than 12 million Africans were kidnapped, transported to the Americas by boat, and forced into slavery. Since the first group of people were brought over in the early 1600s, there have always been those who opposed the institution of slavery. And as the scale of the slave trade spread and grew, and the plantation owners became wealthier and wealthier, so did people's knowledge of the brutality of slavery. Slaves were severely mistreated, overworked, often underfed, beaten, and of course even essayed. Some slaveholders treated their slaves with much more kindness. They fed them well, they didn't beat them, but at the end of the day, they were held there against their will, not paid for the work they did, and were treated as a possession rather than a person, which had to be so infuriating and demoralizing. I can't even imagine. It's really hard to wrap my head around all of the emotions that these people must have been dealing with on a daily or even hourly basis. As abolitionists began to be successful with making more and more people aware of just how badly enslaved people were suffering, there were emotional reactions from people all throughout the colonies, and this spurred abolitionists into action. In 1800, the first major slave rebellion was planned near Richmond, Virginia, under the pretense of a religious meeting. Unfortunately, a thunderstorm delayed the event, and 2 members betrayed the group, which consisted of 1,000 slaves. As things began to heat up between abolitionists and slavery supporters, the American Colonization Society was formed, and in 1816, this society decided that a good compromise would be to free Black people by returning them to Africa. An African colony was created, which would become the Republic of Liberia in 1847. By the year 1860, 12,000 Black people had been returned to Africa in what was known as the Back to Africa movement. But there were some big issues with this. It sounds as if it was assumed by Europeans and slave owners that these people would want to go back to Africa. But in reality, Africa is a very large continent with thousands of different villages and tribes and very diverse people groups. And in many cases, it had been several generations since these people had lived in Africa, and they had lost their language, their cultural identity, and they no longer had the ability to survive in the harsh African climates that their ancestors had come from. And during this time period, there was also no understanding of biological resistance to disease. So those traveling back to Africa often died from illness that they had no immunity to. The African American settlers who returned to Africa had the highest mortality rate of any settler group recorded in human history. Between 1820 and 1843, 4,571 settlers arrived in the African country of Liberia, and of those, only 1,819 survived. This means that about 60% died. Had anyone stopped to ask what they wanted, one can safely assume that most of them probably would have preferred to stay in America where they had been born. They simply wanted to be free to own their own home and work a job that paid a fair wage. But unfortunately, no one stopped to ask them. On August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner led the most well-known and brutal slave rebellion in the history of the United States. The attack involved around 75 Black men and lasted for 2 days. On the first day, they killed 60 white people. And on the second day, the white men they had attacked took their revenge, killing 36 Black men. They regained control of the region, but now feared further revolts. Now, the one upside to this revolt is that it actually did some good in the fact that it ended up causing more people to lend their support to the emancipation of slaves, as they were beginning to see that the institution of slavery might not be a viable way of life. In 1839, there was a slave revolt that took place on a slave ship called Amistad. This caused a political debate that ended in a hallmark decision from the United States Supreme Court declaring the captive people aboard that ship as free. They had the right to resist being unlawfully enslaved. Thomas Smallwood was born into slavery just outside of Washington, D.C. in 1801. When he was 30 years old in 1831, Thomas bought his freedom. By 1842, Thomas, who had been living as a free man for 11 years at that point, was running a shoemaking business out of his home, which he shared with his wife and children. By day, that is. By night, he was busy organizing dozens of journeys to freedom for enslaved people. These early routes led out of Baltimore, away from Washington and surrounding counties. At this point, these clandestine escape routes had not yet been given a name, but Thomas Smallwood was what eventually would be called a conductor on what would eventually be called the Underground Railroad. He was a very outspoken abolitionist who wrote for an abolitionist newspaper that was published in Albany, New York. Writing under a pseudonym, Thomas wrote openly about his hatred for slavery, those who enslaved, and he also wrote about those who had managed to escape and reach freedom. He boldly used each escapee's real name. For many years, Thomas Smallwood's writings were lost to time. They were in a dusty stack in a corner of a Boston public newspaper warehouse. Because of this, Smallwood was relatively unknown until New York Times reporter Scott Shane stumbled upon his writings when he was doing research for a book on Thomas Smallwood. Within Smallwood's writings, Shane found the first known published use of the term Underground Railroad. Smallwood had published an article on August 10th, 1842 in the abolitionist newspaper, The Tocsin of Liberty. In this article, Smallwood wrote with mockery and sarcasm, telling enslavers that their walking property had walked off. While making references to slaves seeming to have disappeared into thin air, he jokingly wrote that they had climbed aboard an underground railroad and were spirited away. After this, the sarcastic answer about how slaves were disappearing became a running theme in Smallwood's future articles. He told those who were missing their workers to go apply at the Office of Underground Railroad in Washington to search for information. He then began referring to himself as the general agent of all branches of the National Underground Railroad. Now, prior to journalist Scott Shane finding these letters, there were a lot of theories about how the Underground Railroad got its name, but all of the other stories were all dated well after Smallwood's articles. And as more abolitionists read Smallwood's articles, the name, the Underground Railroad, began to spread like wildfire. Within a few years, the term Underground Railroad was being widely used to reference the many paths to freedom taken by enslaved people. There were a wide range of articles, books, and leaflets that were using this term. Thomas Smallwood's writings and tireless work to organize escaped routes went a long ways toward giving enslaved people the courage and assistance that they needed to begin their journeys to freedom. The journey was at times perilous. Women and children especially faced difficulties when escaping, as they were rarely allowed to leave the plantation. The Pearl Incident of 1848 has been recorded as the largest escape attempt in U.S. history, with 77 slaves attempting to flee Washington, D.C. using a schooner called the Pearl. Despite their efforts, the boat was seized by a steamboat on the Chesapeake Bay near Maryland, where the slaves were sold to traders and brought to the Deep South. Henry Box Brown was born into slavery in 1815 on a plantation in Virginia. In 1849, when he was 33 years old, he was being hired out by his enslaver to work in a tobacco factory. Henry was married to Nancy, who was also enslaved, but to a different slaveholder. Now, at this time, Nancy and Henry had 3 children, and Nancy was pregnant with their 4th child. And Henry had been paying Nancy's enslaver not to sell his family. Just saying, how sad it is to say that. He was paying him not to sell his family. But Nancy's enslaver betrayed Henry, selling his pregnant wife and 3 children to different slave owners. And this is when Henry decided that enough was enough and he was going to escape. Together with 2 acquaintances, a free black man named James Smith and a sympathetic white shoemaker named Samuel Smith, which coincidentally they have the same last name. No relation, just a common last name. And so Brown devised a plan with these 2 men to ship himself in a box to a free state. Smith consulted with members of the Pennsylvania Anti-Slavery Society on how best to accomplish this escape. Once the details had been arranged, Henry burned his hand to the bone with sulfuric acid to get a sick day off from work at the factory, and he climbed into a 3 by 2.67 by 2 foot box that had been inscribed with the words "dry goods" on the side of it. The box had several holes drilled into it for air, and Henry carried with him something to cut more air holes if he needed them, and he also had some water and a few biscuits. The box weighed 200 pounds, and Henry had given Smith $87 from his savings to pay for the transport, which was about $2,300 in today's money. Over the course of the 27-hour trip, Brown's box was transported by wagon, railroad, steamboat, wagon again, railroad again, ferry, railroad, and finally a delivery wagon. Despite the instructions of handle with care and this side up, several times the carriers handled the box pretty roughly, flipping it upside down twice, and at one point Henry was trapped upside down for 18 miles. He describes the experience. "I felt my eyes swelling as if they would burst from their sockets. The veins of my temples were painfully distended from the pressure of blood on my head." Brown later wrote that his uncertain method of travel was worth the risk. "If you have never been deprived of your liberty as I was, you cannot realize the power of that hope of freedom, which was to me indeed an anchor to the soul, both sure and steadfast." When he was finally released from the box, Brown uttered a psalm of thanksgiving for his safe arrival. Shortly after arriving in Pennsylvania, he was sent to New York, then to Massachusetts, where he joined other abolitionists in helping slaves escape. He traveled around performing reenactments of his escape and tried to help others come up with creative ways that they too could escape. A publisher by the name of Charles Stearns published a version of Henry Brown's escape, and the story became so popular that it has become one of the most well-known stories of an escapee in United States history. Once the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in 1950, Brown, of course, was very well known at this point, and so he was forced to flee yet again, and this time to England. So speaking of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, we're going to be talking about this act quite a bit in today's episode, but this act was quite a blow for enslaved people and abolitionists who were helping to work towards freedom. This act required that escaped slaves must be sent back to their enslavers no matter where they were captured. And this meant that people who managed to escape north to states where slavery had been outlawed were no longer safe. They could be hunted down and returned to the South. And once they were returned, they faced extremely harsh punishments. Like I talked about earlier, there were fugitive slave acts prior to this, but this one was different in that it gave the responsibility for finding and returning the escaped people to the federal government, which gave power to the U.S. Marshal Service and other federal men across the entire United States to hunt down and capture slaves, no matter where in the country they were. Putting the responsibility in the hands of the federal government organized the returns of enslaved people to their enslavers as never before. Not only was the law more strictly enforced, but the punishments for helping a fugitive were much harsher than they had previously been. Federal agents could even deputize private citizens to assist in the capture of runaways. Now, not only was it illegal to help runaways, private citizens were legally required to actively participate in the capture of runaways. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 made the Canadian border the end goal for all people traveling the Underground Railroad because they were no longer safe until they got across that border. In 1852, in response to the outrage of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin was published. This powerful anti-slavery novel was written with the goal of exposing the horrors of slavery. It became an immediate bestseller and is credited with having put a human face on slavery. The tale of escaped slaves slipping through the grasp of slaveholders and evading capture by slave hunters has fascinated Americans for generations. And as with any tale of human heroism, the story of the Underground Railroad has taken on a life of its own, and some of the details are now believed to be a bit overhyped. Take, for example, the idea of the quilts. For years, there has been this fascinating tale of how quilts were hung in windows of homes along the path of the Underground Railroad to lead freedom seekers north. Now, you may have even learned about these quilts in school. There are at least 15 different widely known versions of the story about these quilts and how different symbols on the quilts meant different things. Unfortunately, as compelling as these stories are, there's no written evidence that these quilts were ever used, and these stories were often just passed down word of mouth style. Now, if you're anything like me, you probably immediately were like, well, duh. I mean, word of mouth is how oral history works. But the most compelling argument for the fact that these quilts may not have really been a thing is the fact that the supposed patterns that were used on these quilts didn't come into use until about the 1930s, which of course was well after the Underground Railroad was no longer active. And those African symbols referenced as having been sewn onto the quilts, well, when you look those up, they don't mean what the stories claim the symbols meant. So it appears as though the story of the colorful quilts hung in windows leading the path to freedom may be nothing more than folklore. Now, another part of the story that is believed to be massively overhyped is the amount of safe houses available to runaways. The network in the South was much smaller than we may have initially been led to believe. There were only 2 known safe houses each in the states of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina. While northern states like Washington, D.C. and Maryland had many more sites, and abolitionists sometimes did organize the routes, more often than not, when escaping from the Deep South, freedom seekers had to make it quite a distance on their own before they reached an area where more help was available to them. Those fleeing from Tennessee would cross into Kentucky, where they would have to cross the Ohio River with its deadly strong current. Often they would do this in the dead of night to avoid detection. But if they succeeded, they would be welcomed by the thriving Underground Railroad network in the North. Ohio had 18 known meeting sites and safe houses. Pennsylvania had 15. New Jersey had 9. Massachusetts had 12. And New York State, as small as it was, had 30. While it's obvious that Americans in the northern states wised up to the fact that slavery was terrible much sooner than those in the South, there's also the matter that prior to the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, the safe houses in the North weren't really hiding anyone. They were simply providing shelter and a resting place for travelers. Prior to the backing of the federal government, those previous slave laws weren't really enforced, and slave catchers couldn't rely on local assistance in catching their property. Northerners in free states at that time had a lot less to lose than their counterparts in the South. Of course, after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act, there was a lot more at stake, but the network was already well established and remained strong in the North. People simply started getting more creative and making special places to hide freedom seekers. In fact, there are several historic homes still standing in Salem, Ohio that have secret rooms that can only be accessed by ladders, and the personal journals of the previous homeowners verify that these homes were in fact used on the Underground Railroad. Now, not all of the fantastical sounding stories told about the Underground Railroad were false, and there were code words that were used on the Underground Railroad. Pilots were the code name given to abolitionists who went south with the purpose of finding and helping people who were seeking freedom. An agent was a person who was coordinating the escape. They were making plans, plotting the path, and lining up contacts along the way. Fugitive slaves were codenamed passengers or baggage, depending on the context, and conductors were the people who physically guided escaped slaves to safety. Now, you're probably familiar with Harriet Tubman, who we're going to talk about more in a bit, but she's an example of someone who was a conductor on the Underground Railroad. Operators was an alternative name for both conductors and agents. Most of the conductors were free Black people who had either been born in a free state or obtained their freedom in some way, either by purchasing it or by escaping, which I cannot even imagine the courage that it would take to escape and then come back to help others. Of course, you also had white abolitionists and Native Americans who worked as conductors, but these weren't quite as common. As you can imagine, it was really hard for slaves to trust white people at that time for obvious reasons. The most common way that most of the white abolitionists helped was by making contacts to raise awareness and money and providing safe houses along the routes. Codenamed stations, these safe houses were homes and businesses where fugitive slaves and their conductors could safely hide. Once a passenger arrived at a station, their code name changed to cargo. The homeowners of the safe houses or stations were called station masters. Bundles of wood was the number of freedom seekers who would be expected to arrive. And Canada was referred to as Canaan, as in the land of Canaan in the Bible, or the Promised Land. The Ohio River was renamed the Jordan River, and the Gospel Train or the Freedom Train were both alternative names for the Underground Railroad. There were many people who escaped without the assistance of a conductor, and these people were instructed to follow the drinking gourd, which was the code name for the Big Dipper constellation, and the North Star, which pointed freedom seekers northward. All of the route information was communicated by word of mouth. There were no printed maps or guide, as that was just much too risky. Establishing stations was also done quietly by word of mouth, and very few people kept records about their secret activity in order to protect the homeowners and the fugitives who needed help. If caught, fugitives would be forced to return into slavery, and of course, they would often be severely beaten as well. People caught aiding escaped enslaved people faced arrest, imprisonment, or they could even be put to death. This applied to people living in both slave and free states. Stations were added or removed from the Underground Railroad as ownership of the house changed. If a new owner supported slavery or if the site was discovered to be a station, passengers and conductors were forced to find a new station.
Sometimes I feel like a motherless child.
Because of the need to pass information by word of mouth, coded songs began to be used. Now, these songs are also a well-known part of the Underground Railroad, and if you learned about this topic in school, I'm willing to bet that these songs were part of what they taught you. One of the best known of these songs is called Follow the Drinking Gourd. According to local folklore, there was a man named Peg Leg Joe who traveled between plantations. He was a laborer, but this was just a cover. He was really there to teach local enslaved people around Mobile, Alabama, about the song and its meaning. The lyrics were coded instructions for escaping. It was a verbal map that freedom seekers could follow to the north. It told them how to leave Mobile and go up the river, then where to cross another river, follow that river down, and on and on. The lyrics are as follows. When the sun comes back and the first quail calls, follow the drinking gourd. For the old man is waiting just to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. The riverbank makes a mighty good road. Dead trees will show you the way. Left foot, peg foot, traveling on. Follow the drinking gourd. Where the river ends between two hills, follow the drinking gourd. There's another river on the other side, follow the drinking gourd. Well, where the great river meets the little river, for the old man is waiting just to carry you to freedom if you follow the drinking gourd. If the sky was too cloudy and they weren't able to follow the stars, the Big Dipper, aka the drinking gourd, to point them north, they were told in the song to follow dead trees because moss always grows on the north side of a decaying tree. And this way, they would know that they were headed north. Now, these songs are so intriguing and seem just as fantastical as the stories of the colorful quilts and windows. And so several historians have set out over the years to determine if these songs were really a part of the Underground Railroad, especially because there was no published accounts of these songs until the 1920s. So many were pretty skeptical. However, these are a part of oral history, and these African spirituals have many first-hand accounts to back them up. Some claim to have personally heard these songs across multiple states. Others claim to have gotten the story firsthand from a former slave. And even the famous conductor Harriet Tubman has said that she used songs in this way. And it's believed two of the songs used in her work were Go Down Moses and Bound for the Promised Land.
The words we're saying have a double meaning. So anytime you hear anything about traveling shoes or chariots or wheels, somebody's getting ready to run. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. That chariot is swinging low, picking you up, putting you on that Underground Railroad, taking you somewhere to freedom. Say, I looked over Jordan, and what did I see? Jordan, that was metaphoric for the Ohio River. A band of angels coming after me. Those conductors coming to help you, coming forth to carry me home. So they had all kind of little messages. And the slave master would hear us singing and say, oh, don't they sound pretty happy tonight? Next day, 2 or 3 people gone because we put that message out.
Now, Harriet herself has said that she changed the tempo of these songs to indicate if it was safe to come out of hiding. And the spiritual Wade in the Water is another song that was attributed to Harriet and the Underground Railroad. And this song is believed to have been used to instruct freedom seekers to get in the water so that the slave catchers' bloodhounds couldn't follow their scent. While these songs have been confirmed to be a real thing that was used, Peg-Leg Joe is believed to be a myth. Personally, though, I think that maybe he was more of a concept than an actual person. I'm thinking that maybe there were multiple people playing the parts of Peg-Leg Joe and going around teaching people these songs, because we do know that some of the conductors would dress up as slaves and sneak onto plantations in order to lead groups to freedom. So that's just my personal theory about Peg-Leg Joe. Harriet Elizabeth Beecher was born in Connecticut on June 14th, 1811. She was the 6th of 11 children born to the outspoken Calvinist preacher Lyman Beecher. Harriet went to Hartford Female Seminary and received a traditional academic education, which was pretty uncommon for women at that time. In 1832, at the age of 21, Harriet moved to Cincinnati, Ohio to join her father. During her time there, she attended many debates between those who were for and against the abolishment of slavery. Then in 1833, at the age of 22, Harriet had a life-altering experience when she crossed over the river into the neighboring state of Kentucky. This is the first time that she's ever visited a slave state, and she witnesses firsthand some of the atrocities of slavery. She sees slaves up on the auction block. She sees children literally being ripped from their mother's arms. Harriet is horrified, and she never forgets the awfulness of what she saw that day. Harriet goes on to meet Reverend Calvin Stowe, and the two get married in 1836 and have 7 children together. Eventually, the Stowes moved to Maine, and in 1850, not long after the passing of the Fugitive Slave Law, a runaway knocks on their door. Harriet knows all about the punishment facing anyone who helped a runaway, but she was glad for the opportunity to defy the government. She wrote to her sister that, "Before this law, I might have sent him on to someone else. As it was, all hands in the house united in making him up a bed." Like many Northerners, Harriet was deeply disturbed by the Fugitive Slave Law. As a mother, Harriet felt very deeply about what enslaved mothers must be going through. She wrote, "My heart breaks at the cruelty and injustice our nation inflicts on the slave. I am tormented at the thought of the slave mothers whose babies are torn from them. I pray to God to let me do a little and to cause my cry for them to be heard." Harriet saw a vision of a slave being whipped, and she wrote the ending scene of what would become the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. She reads it to her family. When she's done, they're all crying and they're telling her, "Mama, you just have to write the rest of the story." And so she did. And on March 20th, 1852, a publisher released a book on a difficult subject by an unknown author. By the end of the week, Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin, or Life Among the Lowly, about the horror of slavery, had sold 10,000 copies. Within 2 months, it was 50,000. 3 paper mills feeding 3 printing presses were running 24 hours a day, and still the publisher couldn't keep up. Uncle Tom's Cabin was reaching massive new audiences, many of whom had never read a novel. Then it was adapted into a widely popular play. Through this story, Harriet made millions of Americans see slavery for the first time through the eyes of its victims. The mother whose child was to be sold away, the boy watching helplessly as his sister is whipped, the runaway Liza fleeing with her baby across the Ohio River, only one step ahead of the slave catchers. When the story was put on stage, it said that there was not one dry eye when Eliza reached the other side of the river. Harriet knew that if she could get an emotional reaction from her readers, she didn't need to make arguments about slavery. She realized that she could get further by playing on the heartstrings. Her goal was to get readers to defy the awful, unjust law that was the Fugitive Slave Act by helping them to see that these were actual human beings who were in peril. Uncle Tom's Cabin is considered the most popular and influential book in American history. In a time when many had never even given slavery a second thought, this novel is credited with turning the hearts of millions of Americans into being actively against slavery. Josiah Henson was born into slavery in 1789. He grew up in Maryland, where his father was enslaved by a man named Francis Newman, while Josiah, his mother, and his siblings were enslaved by a separate man, Dr. Joseph McPherson. When he was just a boy, Josiah's father was punished for standing up to a slave overseer. His punishment was 100 lashes, and his right ear was nailed to a whipping post and then cut off. After that, his father was sold away to Alabama. Josiah's enslavers were equally cruel, as he recounts having his arms broken and severe injuries to his back. When Dr. McPherson passed away, the family was put up for sale at the slave auction. His siblings were sold off first, and then his mother. Josiah recalls how his mother begged her new enslaver, Isaac Riley, to purchase her son, Josiah. Riley's response was to hit and kick her. Josiah was purchased by someone else, but then Josiah got very ill, and his mother once again begged her enslaver to purchase her son, promising that once she nursed Josiah back to health, he would work really hard in the fields for his new master. Once he was better, Josiah held up his end of the bargain and worked so hard that he earned the entrusted position of being supervisor on the Riley's farm. During his time of enslavement in Kentucky, Josiah became a Methodist minister. He also got married and had 4 children. In 1828, Josiah attempted to buy his freedom with $350 that he had saved up. shop. He brought this to Riley along with a note promising to pay an additional $100. Riley, however, added an additional $0 to the note, making the fee $1,000. Soon after this, Josiah learned that Riley had plans to sell him in New Orleans, Louisiana, which would separate him from his wife and children. Unwilling to separate from his family, Josiah convinced his wife that it was time to make a run for it. Together with his wife and children, they fled across the Ohio River into Indiana, then to Cincinnati, where they were welcomed at a safe house to rest for a few days before continuing on. The journey was long and hard. After crossing into Ohio, Josiah's wife fainted from exhaustion. The family encountered Native Americans who welcomed them with food and rest. After crossing a lake in Ohio, they encountered a ship captain who agreed to give the family passage to Buffalo, New York, where they passed into Canada. Josiah Henson described the ecstatic feeling of liberation he felt when he crossed over into Canada. He threw himself to the ground, rejoicing with his family. He would never forget the date of October 28th, 1830, as that was the day that he became a free man. Once in Canada, Josiah started working on farms in the area. He sent his oldest son, Tom, to school. Tom brought home what he learned at school and taught Josiah how to read. Once he was able to read, a whole new world was open to Josiah. He was able to develop contacts and eventually got financial assistance to purchase 200 acres on which he founded the Dawn Settlement. Josiah's vision was for this to be a self-sufficient community that helped newly escaped people learn a trade. As part of his abolitionist work, Josiah bravely crossed back into the United States to speak with other abolitionists and raise money for the cause, and also to help escapees along their journey. Hundreds of former slaves came to this settlement over the years, learning a trade and gaining the ability to support themselves and their families in their new country. At one point, this settlement was home to more than 500 people. Josiah purchased an additional 200 acres next to the settlement for him and his family. After the Civil War, when many African Americans returned to the States, Josiah and his family remained in the home that they had made for themselves in Canada. Josiah wrote about the pain of being ripped away from his family as a boy, and also his daring trips back into the United States, and many more details of his life in his book, The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. Josiah Henson is also believed to be the man who inspired the character of Uncle Tom in Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Uncle Tom's Cabin. William Still was born in October of 1821 as a free man in New Jersey. William's father had purchased his freedom, and his mother, Charity, had escaped from slavery in Maryland to the free state of New Jersey. Now, she actually ran away 2 separate times. The first time she ran away, she took all 4 of her children with her, but within a few months, they were caught and brought back. So the second time she ran away, she took only 2 of her children and left the other 2 behind.
I shall never forget hearing my mother speak of the night when she fled. She went to the bed where her 2 boys were sleeping, kissed them, consigned them into the hands of God, and took her departure for the land of liberty.
Now think about what that means to a person. She's got to make a decision. Which of her children is she going to leave in slavery in order for her to experience freedom and 2 of her children to experience freedom? I mean, that's a terrible choice to have to make. How do you make such a decision?
I mean, the slave master had his way with women. And so you take the girls. You figure that the boys would grow into strong men and can kind of defend themselves in some way. But the girls were just there for the taking, for the picking, for the liking, for the evening. So you grab the meekest and you run.
It took them weeks to reach the Delaware River, where they crossed into the free state of New Jersey and were reunited with William's father.
The Still family settled on a 40-acre homestead in a remote farming community. And it's here that William was born and raised, the last of 18 children.
My mother and father were again reunited in freedom, while 2 of the little boys were in slavery. What to do for them, other than weep and pray, were questions unanswerable. For over 40 years, the mother's heart never knew what it was to be free from anxiety about her lost boys.
Still's parents raised their children to be well aware of the horrors of slavery in the South. They also taught them to work hard and to take pride in their work.
And William Still said that dark cloud with which he grew up shaped his character. It taught him compassion. It taught him to love freedom, to hate tyranny and slavery.
As an adult, William married and moved to Philadelphia. He and his wife had 4 children together. William got a job as a clerk for the Philadelphia Society for the Abolition of Slavery, where he became the first Black person to join the society. This is when he became active in the Underground Railroad and remained active in assisting fugitives who passed through the Philadelphia portion of the route for the next 20 years before the Civil War. One of William's greatest accomplishments was teaching himself to read and write. At that time, of course, it was illegal for Black people to learn to read and write, and if it was found out that they could, it would be taken as an act of rebellion and they would be severely punished. After the Fugitive Slave Act passed in 1850, the city's Vigilance Committee was revived. This committee served to assist freedom seekers on their journey, and they appointed William as their chairman. Because of his ability to read and write, William was able to keep records of the people he met during his time as a conductor. William Still helped as many as 800 slaves escape to freedom. He interviewed each person and kept careful records, including a brief biography of the destination of each, along with any alias that they had adopted. He kept his records carefully hidden, but felt they were important because he knew that these accounts could be critical in aiding the future reunion of family members who had become separated under slavery, which he learned when he had ended up aiding his own brother Peter to freedom, whom he had never met before.
He believed these stories had value beyond just the personal story of an individual. He believed that the future generations needed to know about these heroes. If they grew up thinking that they came from a race of cowards, that they believed the stereotypes, that they would be people who did not really accomplish all that they could. They needed role models, they needed heroes, and here were the most heroic people that he could imagine without any better counterpart in history. And so he wanted these stories for the future.
He wrote a letter to the press in 1859 to publicize the discrimination that African Americans faced when riding the streetcars in Philadelphia. He later went on to publish a longer paper about this titled A Brief Narrative of the Struggle of the Rights of the Colored People of Philadelphia in the City Railroad Cars. In 1867, his address was read before a large public audience in Philadelphia. After the war, William continued as an active businessman, philanthropist, and social activist in the Philadelphia metropolitan area. In addition to his coal business, William owned considerable real estate, including Liberty Hall, which at that time was the largest public hall in the United States that was owned by a Black man. He also owned stock in the journal The Nation and was a member of Philadelphia's Board of Trade, as well as multiple other associations having to do with advocating for equal opportunities for all African Americans. He also had a strong interest in the welfare of Black youth, and he helped to establish an orphanage and the first YMCA for African Americans in Philadelphia. And all of this was in addition to being a member on several other orphan homes. He also became a trusted person at Stowe College. In 1872, William published a book titled The Underground Railroad, which included the first-person accounts from 649 formerly enslaved people whom he had come into contact with as they risked their lives to escape to freedom. This book also included first-hand accounts from conductors and other abolitionists, and is now considered to be one of the most accurate accounts of the Underground Railroad due to the numerous first-hand accounts and the included items like ransom notes, letters, and memos. Now, just as a cool little side note, William's oldest daughter, Caroline, became the first Black woman to become a physician in the United States, and she went on to have a very successful private practice in Philadelphia. His other 3 children were also successful. One became a lawyer, one was a journalist, and the other was a teacher. It's honestly emotional to think about how proud he had to have been of his kids and from where he had come from and to where they all ended up. William continued to fight for the rights of African Americans until his death in 1902. In his obituary, the New York Times proclaimed William Still to be the father of the Underground Railroad. Levi Coffin was born in 1798 into a Quaker family who did not believe in owning slaves. The Coffin family lived in North Carolina, where Levi saw slaves in his everyday life. His family began helping runaway slaves by feeding them on their farm. In 1821, William tried to open a school for enslaved people to teach them how to read and write, but in 1821, William tried to open a school for enslaved people to teach them how to read and write, but the school failed because, of course, no slaves were allowed to attend. Levi later moved to Indiana, where he helped more than 2,000 enslaved people on their way north. Levi is thought of as the unofficial president of the Underground Railroad. He had so many people coming and going from his home that it earned the nickname Grand Central Station. In 1847, he moved to Cincinnati, where he started the Western Free Produce Association, which only sold items that were produced by free people. He also set up his new home as another stop on the Underground Railroad. After the Civil War, Levi raised $100,000, which was a lot of money at that time, and he used it to assist newly freed slaves in starting their new lives through his Western Freedmen's Aid Society. John Rankin was a Southern Presbyterian minister who lived from 1793 to 1886. He frequently moved through the South as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, helping many freedom seekers along the way. One of the most popular stories about John is the time that he came across a mother who was trying to escape by crossing the Ohio River while carrying her 2-year-old child. The river was partially frozen, which made the river a little easier to pass, but it was still an extremely terrifying and ambitious feat. Harriet Beecher Stowe used this story as her inspiration for the character Liza Harris in her novel Uncle Tom's Cabin. Over time, John's neighbors began to catch on to what he was doing, and as hostility grew toward him, he moved to Ohio in an attempt to be safer from the constant threats. But angry Kentuckians simply followed him, often attacking his home in Ohio and even placing a $3,000 bounty on his head. Undeterred, John Rankin continued to fight for the rights and freedom of his fellow Black Americans for the rest of his life. Ellen was born into slavery in Georgia in 1826. Ellen's mother was a mixed-race enslaved woman who had been impregnated by her enslaver. And because of this, Ellen is believed to have been about 3/4 European, and she closely resembled her white half-siblings who were her enslaver's legitimate children. When Ellen was 11 years old, her enslaver's wife gave her as a wedding gift to one of her daughters in order to get Ellen out of the house and therefore remove the evidence of her husband's infidelity. Working for her half-sister as a house servant, Ellen gained privileged access to information around the area. William was also born into slavery in Georgia. As a teenager, he watched as his sister and his parents were sold to separate enslavers before he himself was sold at the age of 16 to settle a gambling debt. William's new enslaver apprenticed him as a carpenter and allowed him to work for fees, which of course he took most of. When Ellen was 16, she and William met, and when she was 20, they married. Ellen and William wanted to have a family, but they did not want their children to be born into slavery, and so they came up with a bold plan. Ellen, who, as I mentioned, had very pale skin, would pose as a white gentleman who was traveling with his slave, who, of course, would be William. She posed as a man because it would not have been customary at that time for a woman to travel alone with a man, slave or not. They used William's savings to buy her clothes fitting of a free white man, and William also cut Ellen's hair. Ellen spent time practicing gestures and behaviors fitting her persona. She also put her arm in a sling to fake an injury because she knew that as they traveled, she would be required to sign for her slave, like if they stayed in a hotel or something like that. But of course, having grown up in slavery, Ellen had never been permitted to learn how to read and write. And so having her arm in the sling meant that she had like a good excuse for getting someone else to sign things for her. She also put poultices on her face to further fake an illness so that she wouldn't really be required to talk much. And it was also used as sort of a mask to hide her femininity. During this time periods, slaves commonly traveled with their enslavers, and so they assumed that if someone thought they were just a man and his slave, they wouldn't be stopped or questioned. However, they did get stopped by a policeman, which for some reason suspected them. I didn't get a clear grasp on what happened with that, but Ellen very boldly told him, "You have no right to detain us here." And he let him go. The assumption is that he knew something was up, but he kind of just decided to let it slide. The journey took several days in which the Crafts traveled by train and steamboat, arriving in Philadelphia on Christmas Day. Soon after the Crafts arrived in the North, abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison and William Wells Brown encouraged them to recount their escape in public lectures to abolitionist circles in New England. They moved to the well-established free black community on the north side of Beacon Hill in Boston, where they were married in a Christian ceremony. Ellen Craft posed in her escaped clothes for a photograph, and abolitionists widely distributed it as part of their campaign against slavery. And William and Ellen Craft became some of the most famous escapees from slavery. With the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, their fame meant that the slave hunters knew exactly where to go to find them. However, when they arrived, the community at large was not having it. The slave hunters were harassed by private citizens who followed them around. They had rocks thrown at them. And even the legal system stepped in, arresting the men for like petty things like chewing tobacco and stuff like that. Eventually, the slave hunters had enough and they left. But for the Crafts, this was too close a call, and so they escaped to England, spending the next nearly 2 decades there and raising 5 children together in freedom. In 1860, they published a written account of their escape titled Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, or The Escape of William and Ellen Craft from Slavery. Their tale was one of the most compelling of the many slave narratives published before the Civil War, and their book reached wide audiences in the United Kingdom and the United States. After their return to the U.S. in 1868, the Crafts opened an agricultural school in Georgia for freedmen's children. They worked at the school and its farm until 1890. Their account was reprinted in the United States in 1999, with both the Crafts credited as authors. Arminta Ross was born in March of 1822. Her parents affectionately called her Minty. Her father was free, but because of the law that said if the mother was enslaved, the children would be also, Minty and her 8 siblings were all born into slavery. Their enslaver took extra care to make sure that all of the family members were working separately from one another. And at the age of 6, Minty was rented out to provide childcare for nearby overseers. Of course, Minty's enslaver was the one who received the payment for her work. Often that work kept her away from her family for extended periods of time. In 1835, a 13-year-old Minty's life would forever be changed. While running errands at a local store, she witnessed a slave attempting to escape. As the enslaver became desperate in their attempt to recapture the freedom seeker, he threw a 2-pound weight. And rather than hitting the intended target, he struck Minty in the back of the head and fractured her skull. She teetered between life and death as her mother nursed her back to health as best she could given her limited resources. Of course, Minty was put back to work before she was fully recovered, and after the incident, physical pain became a consistent part of Minty's life. She experienced chronic pain from headaches and uncontrollable bouts of seizures, which Minty herself referred to as sleeping spells. Historians now believe that Minty had narcolepsy, which is a chronic neurological disorder that affects the brain's ability to control sleep and wake cycles. Despite her health issues and the confinements of enslavement, Minty was determined to take some kind of control over her own life. She negotiated with her enslaver to select her own work assignments. He agreed as long as she paid him a yearly fee. From then on, Minty hired herself out on her own terms. Working in various places around the county, Minty became very familiar with the area, and this would play a key part in her journey to freedom. On one assignment, Minty was able to select a job working alongside her father, whom she had not seen in years. Additionally, this job had her working alongside black sailors who were free men. These men were transporting the lumber that her company was cutting, and they traveled all along the East Coast, so they shared their knowledge of the surrounding area and aided Minty in tapping into the network of those seeking freedom. It was while working this job that Minty met and married a free black man by the name of John Tubman. And this is when she changed her name from Arminta to Harriet after her mother and became Harriet Tubman. Narcolepsy is believed to have been a prominent part of Harriet's identity and story, as this is what brought on the vivid visions of freedom that came to her while experiencing her seizures. Over the years, Harriet's visions have been attributed to her religiosity, but while we do know that Harriet was a woman of strong faith, her health condition is now considered a contributor alongside her faith when it came to her determination to seek liberation for the enslaved. It's said that Harriet cherished the years spent working alongside her father and her time as a newlywed, but it wasn't long before there were rumors that she and her brother were to be sold. When their enslaver passed away, Harriet was more concerned than ever that the widow would go through with the sale. So, using the wealth of knowledge she had gained over the years, Harriet set her sights on escaping to Philadelphia. After developing a route, Harriet and her brothers set out. Word came that their enslaver's widow had put an ad in the paper for their return, and fearing punishment, Harriet's two brothers returned to the plantation. Harriet, though, had no intention of returning. Her vision had assured her that she would be free, and so she continued alone. First guided by the stars, and then assisted by abolitionists, Harriet traveled from Maryland to Pennsylvania, where she made more connection and learned all about the Underground Railroad. The more she learned, the more her desire to free her family grew. Finally, in 1850, she returned for them. After a successful first trip, in which she had brought both friends and family to freedom, she became a conductor on the Underground Railroad. She succeeded in her second journey as well, and on to her third. In 1851, Harriet returned for her husband, John. She quickly discovered that he had thought she was dead and had remarried. John's new wife was pregnant. Though heartbroken, Harriet's commitment to freedom knew no bounds, and she offered to take the couple to freedom. But John refused. With the passing of the Fugitive Slave Act making things more difficult for freedom seekers, the trips were, of course, longer as the final destination was now Canada. Harriet conducted 11 trips from Maryland to St. Catharines, Ontario, Canada between 1850 and 1860. All of these journeys, 19 in total, over the years made Harriet a hero, with many African Americans, both free and enslaved, dubbing her the Moses of her people. Of course, after the biblical figure. While wildly celebrated within her own community, Harriet was infamous among enslavers. Many called for her capture with bounties upwards of $40,000, which would have been over $1.5 million in today's money. Between 1850 and 1860, Tubman brought approximately 70 individuals, including her parents, to freedom. Harriet spoke proudly of her accomplishments and famously stated, "I never ran my train off the track and I never lost a passenger." After initially bringing her parents to Canada, Harriet returned with them to America and settled in Auburn, New York. This area was a hotbed for abolitionists and felt like a good home for them. In 1857, she met the famous abolitionist John Brown. John was outspoken in his support of anti-slavery, and though unpopular among white Southerners, his efforts were largely supported by those in the North. Harriet and Brown formed a close friendship, with Brown dubbing her General Tubman. She once claimed to have seen him in many of her narcoleptic dreams before ever having met him in person. The pair worked together, including on Brown's plans for the raid on Harper's Ferry in Virginia. Harriet provided her geographical expertise and recruited formerly enslaved people to assist in the raid. While planned as a way to steal guns and start a revolt to flee slaves across the South, the raid ultimately ended in failure. An army unit led by future Confederate General Robert E. Lee captured Brown and put him on trial for treason, murder, and inciting a slave rebellion. Brown was hung shortly after. In April 1861, the American Civil War broke out. Harriet saw an opportunity to get involved and enlisted in the Union Army as a nurse, where she cared for wounded soldiers with natural remedies. In 1863, Harriet took on the role of a scout and organized a group of spies. She recruited enslaved people interested in assisting the Union. Harriet helped Colonel James Montgomery coordinate the Combahee River Raid in South Carolina, which aimed to harass whites and rescue freed slaves. The raid was wildly successful, with Montgomery's troops burning down many plantations and freeing approximately 750 slaves. With their newfound freedom, many of the formerly enslaved men opted to join the Union's fight against the Confederacy. Harriet Tubman is recognized as the first woman in U.S. history to both plan and lead a military raid. In June of 2021, the Army inducted Harriet Tubman into the Military Intelligence Corps. During her time with the Union Army, Harriet met her second husband, Nelson Davis. The couple married in 1869 in Auburn, New York, where he, Harriet, and her freed family members would live out their days. Nelson built the family a home, which currently still stands. It's also in Auburn where Harriet founded the Home for the Aged, which was an institution that provided care for those with paralysis, epilepsy, and those with vision impairment and blindness. In 1913, Harriet Tubman died of pneumonia at the age of 91. In her final words, Harriet called upon her faith and made reference to John 14:3 in the Bible. She stated, "I go away to prepare a place for you, that where I am, you also may be." Though many thousands of freedom seekers evaded capture, the Fugitive Slave Act that we keep talking about meant that some freedom seekers were recaptured and sent back into slavery. Anthony Burns was enslaved in Virginia. For being a slave, he had more privileges than most. He was allowed to hire himself out, and he was also trusted with supervising the hiring out of 4 other slaves. He was also given the freedom to take additional jobs as long as he paid his master a fee. He joined a church where he became a preacher, and he even learned to read and write. Still, Anthony Burns was not content. At an early age, he had learned that there was a Christ who came to make us free, and he felt that the necessity for freedom was for both soul and body. In 1854, he took steps to find freedom. While working in Richmond, Burns boarded a ship headed north to the city of Boston. He arrived in Boston in March, a fugitive but free. This newfound freedom, however, would be short-lived. Soon after his arrival, he sent a letter to his brother, who was also a slave of Charles Suttle, and even though the letter was sent by way of Canada, it found its way into the hands of their enslaver. A few years earlier, the enslaver Suttle could have expected little to no help from a northern state in recovering a fugitive slave. 9 states had personal liberty laws declaring that they would not cooperate with the federal government in recapturing of slaves. But with the recent passing of the infamous Fugitive Slave Act, the law was on Suttle's side. Suttle traveled to Boston to claim his property, and on May 24th, under the pretext of being charged for robbery, Burns was arrested. Boston abolitionists, vehemently opposed to the Slave Act, rallied to aid Burns, who was being held on the 3rd floor of the federal courthouse. 2 separate groups met at the same time to discuss Burns' recapture. A large group consisting mainly of white abolitionists met at Funeral Hall, and a smaller group, mostly blacks, met in the basement of the Tremont Temple. The meeting at the Tremont Temple was over quickly. Those present decided to march to the courthouse and release Burns, using force if necessary. The meeting at Funeral Hall lasted much longer. The group there spent much more time debating their course of action. When the intention of the Tremont Temple gathering were announced, however, the meeting abruptly ended and 200 citizens left Funeral Hall and headed to the courthouse to join the others. The crowd outside the courthouse quickly grew from several hundred to about 2,000. A small group of blacks led by white minister Thomas Wentworth Higginson charged the building with a beam that they used as a battering ram. They succeeded in creating a small opening, but only for a moment. A shot was fired. A deputy shouted out that he had been stabbed, then died several moments later. Higginson and a black man gained entry, but were beaten back outside by 6 to 8 deputies. This was nothing new for this group, as Boston inhabitants had successfully aided recaptured slaves in the past. In 1851, a group of black men had successfully snatched a fugitive slave right out of the courtroom and sent her to Canada. Anthony Burns, however, would not share that same fate. Determined to see the Fugitive Slave Act enforced, President Franklin Pierce ordered Marines and artillery to assist the guards watching over Burns. Pierce also ordered a federal ship to return Burns to Virginia after the trial. Burns was convicted of being a fugitive slave on June 2nd, 1854. That same day, an estimated 50,000 people lined the streets of Boston watching Anthony Burns walk in shackles toward the waterfront and the waiting ship. A black church soon raised $1,300 to purchase Burns' freedom, and in less than a year, Anthony Burns was back in Boston. 19th century women can be challenging to locate in historical record, which means they are typically not recognized for their contributions to the Underground Railroad. Often a man would be recognized, but his wife, who was just as active in the railroad, may not have been recognized at all. Now, I would speculate that sometimes the facts that women weren't taken very seriously back then kind of helped them in their effort at times. It certainly made them into good spies at times. Now, if you investigate a bit further into primary sources such as conductor account books, newspapers, letters, and journals, you're provided with evidence of the many contributions of women to the Underground Railroad, and in particular, Boston's women. Between 1830 and 1860, Boston women routinely attended fugitive slave trials, joined and founded anti-slavery foundations, led potential drives, fundraised, created written records of abolitionist events, operated as spies, and sheltered freedom seekers in their homes. These women risked their own safety and freedom in a courageous effort to extend help to freedom seekers across the nation. There were dozens of women in Boston who dedicated themselves to the success of the Underground Railroad. And there are many, many more whose names we may never know. The ones we are aware of are thanks in part to the private journals that have now been added to the public archives. In 1854, Bostonian Martha Russell witnessed the return of Anthony Burns to enslavement. As an eyewitness to Burns' forced march down State Street, Martha recorded her account in her journal. Did you ever feel every drop of blood in you boiling and burning and seething, throbbing and burning until it seemed you should suffocate? Did you ever set your teeth hard together to keep down the spirit that was urging you to do something to cool your indignation that good and wise people would call violence treason? I have felt all this today. I have seen that poor slave Anthony Burns carried back to slavery. Journals from women like Martha Russell preserved the history of anti-slavery in Boston and represents the importance of their contribution to the Underground Railroad. It's also interesting to note that women's involvement in the Underground Railroad kind of bled over into the women's suffrage movement, with women like Susan B. Anthony, who of course was a Quaker who was famous for her work in women's suffrage, having gotten their start in activism through their work on the Underground Railroad. Several of these women were even friends with the famous African-American abolitionist Frederick Douglass, though Susan and Frederick were known to have had some drama during heated debates, but that's a story for another day. Frederick was known to have supported the cause for a woman's right to vote. Harriet Tubman also worked alongside Susan B. Anthony and several other prominent figures in the suffrage movement in upstate New York. The protests of abolitionists were aligned closely with those of suffragists, with both movements concerned with autonomy and freedom. And in fact, if you research this, you'll see some of the same names come up in both movements over and over again, which makes perfect sense, but it's just not something I had ever really given thought to before now. In 1854, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was a new mandate that stated that settlers in new United States territories would decide if these regions became free or slave states. At this point, the Republican Party, which had been recently formed, gained strength and vowed to prevent new states from becoming slave states. The Republican Party quickly became the leading party in most all the northern states and territories. This was a huge victory for the enslaved people and the abolitionists who were working to free them. In 1857, another hallmark case called Dred Scott versus Sanford in the Supreme Court passed a ruling stating that Black people were not official citizens of the United States. This case also led to Congress being unable to prohibit slavery in any state or territory. Dred Scott was a free Black man who had been born into slavery in Missouri and then had been moved by his slaver to Illinois, which meant he was living in a state where slavery had been outlawed. He tried to purchase his freedom in the free state and was denied. This is what led to the trial, and the ruling meant he was not entitled to his freedom simply because he lived in a free state. This case also rolled back part of the Missouri Compromise, which had declared the territories west of Missouri and north of latitude 36 degrees, 30 minutes north as free, declaring it was unconstitutional. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and rising tensions between the slave states and free states came to a head, leading the slave states in the South to secede from the Union. At the start of the Civil War in 1860, the population of Black people, according to the census, was 4,441,830. Of those, 3,953,760 were enslaved and 488,070 were free. Around 185,000 soldiers fought for the Union and their freedom. The abolitionist movement helped spark the Civil War, which subsequently became the catalyst for constitutional change. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 declared all slaves in Confederate-held territory to be forever free. And while the war still raged on, this proclamation meant that if the North won the war, slavery would end in the United States of America. The war finally ended in April of 1865, and on December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution was officially ratified. This applied to all enslaved people across the entire country, putting an end to the institution of slavery in the United States. As the Civil War drew to a close, the Union grappled with how best to integrate millions of newly freed slaves into the American social, economic, and political frameworks. The Republicans in Congress during Reconstruction played a pivotal role in framing and passing the 14th Amendment. They sought to counteract the Black Codes, which were laws passed throughout the South that severely restricted African Americans' new freedoms. The Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment overrode the Dred Scott versus Sanford decision of 1857, which held that African Americans could not be American citizens, whether enslaved or free. Under the new amendment, citizenship was granted to all persons born or naturalized in the United States. This was a direct response to former slaves' uncertain status. The 14th Amendment was passed by Congress on June 13, 1866, and was ratified on July 9, 1868. Once adopted, the 14th Amendment became a foundational text for future civil rights advancements in the U.S. Its Equal Protection Clause has been fundamental in various landmark Supreme Court decisions, including Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, which ended racial segregation in public schools. The 14th Amendment continues to affect debates on immigration and rights of those born in the U.S. Its birthright citizenship provision remains highly debated, as it ensures that anyone born on U.S. soil is an American citizen regardless of the citizenship status of that child's parents, leading to concerns about so-called anchor babies and the economic effects on American citizens. Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a slavery abolition act in 1833. France followed suit, abolishing slavery in 1848, and finally, with the 13th Amendment, America put an end to this terrible practice in 1865. Up until the time of the Civil War, most white Americans, both North and South, either actively fought to maintain the institution of slavery or just passively benefited from it, not really even giving it a second thought. Only a small fraction had the moral clarity to recognize its evils without caveat or compromise. And before the war broke out, very few did anything to directly challenge it. Fewer still took the kind of action that later made agents of the Underground Railroad such widely admired figures. All in all, it's believed that nearly 100,000 people escaped slavery through the Underground Railroad systems. Some estimates believe that there were about 3,000 persons who assisted in the Underground Railroad, while others believed that number was only in the hundreds. While slavery at the time was an institution, the Underground Railroad was personal, with scattered private citizens acting on their conscience and connected, for the most part, only as the constellations are, from a great distance by their light. We're drawn to these stories because they show us not only the worst of us, but also the best of us. Through these abolitionists, we see the best in our nation. When Congress approved funding for the Network of Freedom, it noted correctly that the Underground Railroad bridged the divides of race, religion, sectional differences, and nationality, spanned state lines and international borders, and joined the American ideals of liberty and freedom expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to the extraordinary actions of ordinary men and women working in common purpose to free a people. These were ordinary people, both free and enslaved, who took extraordinary actions to end the social acceptance and eventually the institution of slavery as a whole. Comment down below and let me know if you learned anything new in today's episode. If you enjoyed this episode, you will love this one. And before you go, don't forget to check out Ana Luisa's Black Friday deals. Their pieces are stunning and this sale is for a limited time. So check out my link in the description box down below and don't miss out on grabbing your favorites before they're all gone.